Welcome to the Israelis' assault on Gaza 1 year later, the lecture and panel discussion. I'm Mark Sanders, the director of the Initiative on Race and Resilience. And in my capacity as director, I welcome you into this space, the Sojourner Truth Commons. I ask you at this point, if you haven't already done so, to silence your cell phones. The Initiative on Race and Resilience pursues a dual mission to confront systemic racism and support communities of color. In that spirit, we welcome the invitation from Professor Omer and Contending Modernities to provide the space for a charged but very necessary discussion of Israeli-Palestinian relations. First, I want to thank Professor Atalia, Omer, and her speakers, Professor Raz Segal, Professor Ernesto Verdeja, and Dr. Thalia Pachiyannakis. Thank you for visiting us and helping us to participate in a global discussion of the highest importance. Also, I would like to thank Ms. Pauline Namalam. I don't know if she's in the room. Many of you met her because you had to give her your bags. Thank you, Pauline. Pauline is the administrative assistant for IRR. Thank you, Ms. Aria Hernandez-Webster. Aria is here in the corner. She is the program manager for IRR. And thank you, Ms. Shannon Carter, who may be somewhere in the back. She is the administrative assistant for the Department of Africana Studies. Thank you for attending to all of the practical details to organize this event. This moment would be impossible without your efforts. We gather here to pursue complex and difficult questions for which there are no easy answers. Nevertheless, I truly believe that the intellectual work that we do today is part of a larger project to promote peace. In order to ensure a civil and respectful exchange of ideas, we ask that you write your questions on an index card. And if you haven't gotten an index card, one will be provided for you. Please give your written questions to an usher, and we'll do all the trafficking. That's an awful word to use. Do you call the organizer at the end of the official addresses to collect the cards? And either Professor Omer and I will read the cards during the question and answer period. All comments, written or oral, towards our guests must be given with the courtesy and respect with which you would like to be addressed. To be more direct, no personal attacks will be tolerated. And with that, I introduce Professor Omer, who will introduce our guests and will preside over the discussion. Professor Omer is a professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs and is a core faculty member in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. She is the author, among many publications, of Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building, and When Peace Is Not Enough, How the Israeli Peace Camp Thinks About Religion, Nationalism, and Justice. Please join me in welcoming
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Welcome everyone to this important conversation. As you just heard, my name is Atalia Omer. I'm professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I'm here primarily in my capacity as co-director of the Contending Modernities Research Initiative, which is one of this event's co-sponsoring units, along with the Initiative on Race and Resilience, Professor Sanders here, and the Center for Social Concerns. So I'm very excited about this collaboration. I think it's meaningful. And I'm eager to launch right into the panel. Still, before we do, I want to take a moment for meditation at this time of the horrific anniversary, knowing that horrors in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and the border region persist and in fact escalate.
You might need a little bit longer for the back.
Okay. I don't know what to do. It's kind of like, okay. I can move the mic. It's important to note that now we are reaching the end of the days of awe, or in Hebrew, Hayamim HaNoraim, days of atonement. This is the period in the Jewish kind of liturgical cycle between Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is when people wrestle with their sins individually and collectively. They do not know if they will be written into the book of life or death. In my ethnographic research for the book that was just mentioned, titled Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, I learned that many American Jews who want to embrace a consistent appreciation of life and dignity for all understand the moment of the Days of Awe symbolically as a space outside our comfort zones, a space that disrupts binaries, since one doesn't know if they will be written in the book of life or death. Binaries, which is how so much of the discussion about Palestine-Israel is articulated and framed, offer a false sense of clarity and moral security. I invite you to close your eyes and center your thoughts on the Jewish principle that every human is olam umelo'o, an entire universe. This potentially resonates with all our normative traditions, including humanism, when they do not create hierarchies of life. Accordingly, some humans are more grievable than others. What does olam umelo'o mean to us today, amid utter destruction and death, when so many people and their memories, universities, daycare centers, clinics, bakeries, and museums are treated as collateral damage? Collateral damage for what? What do my security and freedom mean if they entail and are predicated on someone else's insecurity, unfreedom, and destruction? One place to begin with an answer that should be self-evident is that a Palestinian baby has the same value as every Jewish Israeli baby. As we center our thoughts and create a space for a meaningful, evidence-based conversation, I want to read a few short pieces or quotes from them. The first is a part of a supplement for Yom Kippur year, slightly edited by me. In a memorial prayer for sacred life lost, Nathaniel Zelis Pili writes, please reflect on the souls of all who have been killed in this horrific period, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists, men and women, the elderly, and the young babies and nursing infants, who were killed, slaughtered, burned, buried alive, and starved to death in Gaza and the Gaza envelope, in Beit Hanun and Be'eri, in Kfar Aza, in Khan Yunis, in Userat refugee camp, and Nachal Oz, in Re'im and Rafah. The second quote is from Rabbi Brent Rosen's Rosh Hashanah sermon, in which he incidentally quotes Professor Raz Segal, our main speaker today. Rabbi Rosen writes, but beyond the legal argument, there is a critical moral imperative behind the claim, and here he refers to the use of the comparative legal category of genocide, which we will discuss today shortly. He writes, Rabbi Rosen writes, we need to interrogate how Israel metabolizes the traumatic memory of the Holocaust as a way to rationalize its genocidal violence in Gaza. Before inviting you to a moment of silence and meditation, let me finally recite If I Must Die by Rafat al-Alamir, who was killed in Gaza. He was a Gazan poet killed by Israel in Gaza on December 6, 2023. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dead, who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. Let us now observe a moment of silence. Let us be silent in Alavir's memory and the memory of all who have suffered unimaginable losses in the last year. This week, we mark 1 year and over 100 years of historical context. This is why having honest and fearless conversations in academic spaces, offering evidence-based research, power analysis, and historical depths is important to avoid Manichaean narratives and deductive binaries in favor of historical and analytic rigor and evidence-based research. Doing anything else will amount to intellectual dishonesty, pedagogical cowardice, and ethical failure. Sometimes the evidence is hard to compute if it implicates us with violence, and we wish to resist it from our place of discomfort and through appeals to innocence and or victimhood. However, one cannot confuse discomfort with harm and recognize that transformation and change must come from our ability to precisely name what we see as what it is. So we recognize this event may generate many big emotions, and we want to ask everyone to respect this academic space, as my colleague just said, and what it can offer, which is a lot of analytic depth and firsthand witnessing. The format of the event, as was mentioned, is going to be as follows. Professor Raz Segal, our main speaker, will lecture for about 30 minutes. He will then be responded to by Professor Ernesto Verdeja, an expert grounded in genocide studies. While Professor Verdeja's response will interact with Professor Segal's analysis from the analytic space of the comparative study of genocide, Dr. Thalia Pachiyannakis will offer a response from what she saw on the ground in Gaza when she volunteered there this past June. I will introduce the speakers before they speak, rather than all of them all at once. As you will see, as Professor Sanders mentioned, you each have a note card. Please write down your questions concisely and clearly as they emerge during the panel. We will have time to collect them and interact with as many questions or clusters of questions as possible. So let us then begin. Professor Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. Dr. Segal has held a Harry Frank Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and he was recently a senior fellow at the Vienna Wissenschaft Institute for Holocaust Studies. That was in 2023, and an American Council of Learned Society, ACLS fellow, of the Summer Institute for the Study of East Central and Southeastern Europe, in collaboration with the Center for Advanced Studies in Sofia and the American University in Bulgaria in 2024. His publications include Genocide in the Carpathians, Wars, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence, 1914 to 1945, which came out in 2016, Days of Ruin, the Jews of Munkacs during the Holocaust, that came out in 2013, and he was guest editor of the Hebrew language special issue on genocide, mass violence, and cultural erasure of Zmanim, a historical quarterly that came out in 2018. He is at work on a book right now on the distortion, weaponization, and mobilization of Holocaust history in the reproduction of white supremacy and state violence, including a focus on Israel's assault on Palestinians from the 1948 Nakba to the current genocidal assault on Gaza. In addition to scholarly publication, he has published opinion pieces, book reviews, and larger articles on genocide, state violence, and memory politics in Hebrew, English, and German, as wide as venues as The Guardian, the LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, Haaretz, 972 Magazine, Time Magazine, The Forward, and Berlinger's Zeitung. And he has appeared on Counterpoints, MSNBC, Al Jazeera English, Democracy Now!, and ABC News. So with that, let's welcome Professor Raz Segal.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much thank you, Thalia, for the invitation, and thank you for all the organizers and the sponsors. I know this took a lot of effort and time, and it's very important. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you for everyone who came, and Ernesto and Thalia, it's an honor to be in conversation with you. I have to admit, I'm just mostly very sad these days, beyond anything else. and I'm going to try to take you from my argument about the weaponization of Holocaust history, even before October 7th, and into Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, and partly as a way to think through not just my sadness, but I think a lot of people are. This is very overwhelming to witness a year of this sort of assault live stream. So into an argument about what I call the rise of global Nakba. So. U.S. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez argued in June 2019 in a short video that the United States was running concentration camps on its southern border, interning refugees and asylum seekers. Everyone can hear me at the back also there? Yes? Okay. She added that never again should mean something. All hell broke loose. And part of it included the press release of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on 24th of June, stating that the museum, quote, unequivocally rejects efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. Now, this made no sense. Ocasio-Cortez did not actually create an analogy. Rather, she tapped into the slogan of the USHMM itself, never again, what you do matters. And if we take that slogan seriously, it does, of course, necessitate analogies, for otherwise we cannot actually know that an unfolding process of state violence is unfolding in a way that turns on all the red lights that we teach our students to detect. Many people found the USHMM press release and its insistence on a particularly extreme version of the idea that the Holocaust is unique, right? This argument, very strange. Almost 600 scholars, which included all or nearly all Holocaust scholars in the world, including myself, signed a letter to the USHMM demanding that the Institute retract this statement because of its, quote, fundamentally ahistorical approach. To no avail. The USHMM, with the US government as its boss, doubled down on its position, even in the face of an overwhelming consensus among Holocaust scholars who otherwise disagree vehemently about everything. Now, that this statement came in response to what we call refugee crisis was not coincidental. More than 100 million refugees and other forcibly displaced people around the world today, which is more than twice as many, right, as at the end of World War II, who have survived and fled destructive state violence, should remind us what historians, the Ward Ward, Tarazara, and others have shown in their work the last 15 to 20 years, that the history of the Holocaust is also a history of refugees, primarily Jewish refugees. But we should not actually talk about more than 100 million people as a crisis in an otherwise functioning political system of nation states. Rather, these people expose the exclusionary and violent rationale of this system. They also lay bare a key problem in what we call global Holocaust memory. For this memory culture, which is a set of ideas about the Holocaust produced and maintained by institutes, and first and foremost, the idea that the Holocaust is unique. This memory culture is managed by state institutes, including the USHMM. And as state institutes, their aim, and indeed the rationale, will always be to provide legitimacy to the state, not to protect its victims. In other words, global Holocaust memory never aimed to realize the call, never again. Nowhere is this problem more acute than in Israel, which emerged in part through the migration to Palestine and from 1948 to Israel of Holocaust survivors, and through the mass deportations of more than 750,000 Palestinians, whom Israeli forces turned into refugees. This large-scale state violence, the 1948 Nakba, also included massacres of thousands and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages. The founding of the Jewish nation state as an exclusionary state from the very beginning immediately, therefore, came into acute tension with what everyone knew very well at the time about the Holocaust and refugees. The idea of Holocaust uniqueness played an important role in responding to this tension from the very beginning. It followed from this idea, the Holocaust is unique, that Israel, the state where many Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, is also unique. The concept of genocide has functioned from its formulation in the UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948, the year of Israel's founding. The concept of genocide functioned in relation to this double uniqueness of the Holocaust in Israel. Nazism and what we now call the Holocaust, no one used the word at the time, were imagined through the concept of genocide on a hierarchy as more terrible than genocide, right? Think about this combination in my title, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is very strange, actually. And this placed Israel on another imagined hierarchy as more moral than any other state in the world. Now, this gave rise to a common view in Israel and the West that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. So that from Israel's establishment, it became unimaginable and actually unspeakable that Israel would perpetrate any crime under international law, let alone genocide. So this is a very important point. Nakba denial, the denial of the 1948 Nakba, emerged actually, tragically, as a structural element in both Holocaust memory and the international legal system that emerged after World War II, with genocide as its key innovation. It is remarkable then that Israeli leaders, politicians, and journalists have used the word Nakba numerous times since 7th of October, now admitting rather than denying the 1948 Nakba and pushing for, quote, a second Nakba. And just two quite well-known examples. Ariel Kalner, a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, for the ruling Likud party, called on 7th of October on X for, quote, Nakba to the enemy, Nakba. Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Notice how many times he says the word Nakba here. An Israeli cabinet minister, Avi Dichter, described the second Nakba on Israeli TV openly in November 2023 as the Gaza Nakba. Now, perpetrators of state violence rarely shift from denial to recognition in this way, certainly not during unfolding violence. There are so many things that are unprecedented in what's happening in front of our eyes in the last year. We see it in this case because the perpetrators, that is Israeli military and political leaders, but also think about the many thousands of soldiers and officers on the ground who have uploaded evidence of their own crimes into social media proudly. These people imagine that they are fighting a colonial war against, quote, human animals. As Israel's war minister, Yoav Gallant, and I insist on calling him war minister and not defense minister, Yoav Gallant described, it's the way he described Palestinians in Gaza already on 9th of October. Just as German colonial military authorities saw no problem in issuing, quote, an extermination order in response to the violent uprising of the Herero people against German colonialism and occupation and oppression in Southwest Africa in 1904, that order was the order for the ensuing German colonial genocide of the Herero and Nama in the following 4 years. In the same way, Israelis perceived their destructive assault on Palestinians as a justified war against colonized barbarians. This is, in other words, Israeli settler colonialism taking to its horrific conclusion. But this Israeli war on Palestinians did not begin on October 7th. Israelis have been waging it since the 1948 Nakba in various ways, including, lest we forget, a 16-year siege on Gaza before October 7th, the longest siege in modern history. This war is what Palestinians have always described as the ongoing Nakba, aimed at realizing Israeli settler colonialism, the creation of a greater Israel with as few Palestinians as possible and as many Jews as possible. Nakba denial then always required that Israelis depict Palestinians as far away from victims and refugees as possible. Hence, not only in typical colonial dehumanized terms, but also as ultimate evil, Nazis. Among the more well-known examples are Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin comparing in 1982, in the context of that Israeli attack on Lebanon, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in Beirut to Adolf Hitler in his bunker in Berlin at the end of World War II. 3 decades later, in October 2015, it was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who took this weaponization to new levels when he asserted in a speech to the World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem that the Palestinian Grand Mufti Haj Jamil al-Husseini planted the idea to murder Jews in Hitler's mind. This was, of course, an unashamed fabrication without any basis whatsoever in historical reality. But the stage was thus set for former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett to respond angrily in an interview on Sky News on 12th of October, you remember, to questions at the time about a high civilian death toll already in those first few days of Israel's attack on Gaza. And Bennett says, I'm sure you remember this, we are fighting Nazis. Do you remember this? Netanyahu followed 5 days later in a press conference together with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz with a description of Hamas as the new Nazis. And a couple weeks later, on 5th of November, Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu, member of the far-right Jewish Power Party, demonstrated in a radio interview the slippage in Israeli politics, media, and society from describing only Hamas as Nazis to describing all Palestinians as Nazis. He said that he objects to humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza because, quote, we would not hand Nazis humanitarian aid. He then suggested also the possibility of dropping a nuclear bomb. Israel's attack on Gaza has in fact included the dropping so far of more than 85,000 tons of explosives, which are the equivalent, as we now know, of more than 3 atomic bombs of the kind that this country dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. Israeli bombings and invasion have left the vast majority of the Gaza Strip almost completely destroyed, as everything is targeted. Everything, residential buildings, hospitals, schools, all the universities, cultural sites, archives, bakeries, agricultural fields, and all the people, of course. It has killed well over 43,000 Palestinians, which is the official number, right? Including well over 16,000 children, again, the official figures currently. Many of them in areas where Israel has forced Palestinians to seek refuge as quote unquote safe zones. That is a measure of international humanitarian law that we now know that Israel has weaponized in order to enhance its assault of Palestinians. Israel's attack has also wounded over 100,000 people, many of them with injuries that will remain for them for life, and forcibly displaced nearly the entire population of 2.3 million people who are now facing famine conditions, a result of Israel's total siege policies that Israeli War Minister Gallant declared on 9th of October when he described Palestinians in Gaza as human animals. Now, if it remained unclear whether Gallant was describing only Hamas militants in this way, again, or all Palestinians, Israeli coordinator of government activities in the occupied territories, Major General Hassan Aliyan, clarified it in a video the next day directly to the Palestinians in Gaza, saying Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. Human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell, you will get hell. Does it get any more explicit than this? And so Israelis with command authority, what we call command authority in international law, that is state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, have cast Palestinians as a whole as enemies, as human animals, as Amalek, as Nazis, immediately after October 7th, and many, many times in the months that followed, and ongoing. We still hear explicit expressions, what's called in international law, intent to destroy. The organization Law for Palestine has documented on its website actually hundreds of genocidal expressions in Israeli society and politics and media, but dozens of people with command authority that fits intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such. That is because they are Palestinians, to quote the definition of the crime of genocide in the UN Genocide Convention. The Israeli army has also done exactly what Israel's leaders declared that they will do, because for the crime of genocide, we need the intent, and then we need also to match it with the violence on the ground. And that's exactly what Israel has done. It turned Gaza into a place, as Hassan Aliyan said, with only destruction, that is, into a hell. In addition to the level of destruction and killings, which many experts in various fields are telling us is unprecedented since World War II, Israel's mass starvation policies have, quote, the third form of violence in the convention, created condition calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Indeed, if Israel's attack stops now, we know that Palestinians in Gaza will continue to die in large numbers, in the tens and probably in the hundreds of thousands, as a result of the conditions that Israel has intentionally created in its attack. Not to mention the trauma and the suffering that will accompany Palestinian survivors for decades and for generations to come. What we are seeing in this case, in other words, is not genocide. I don't know what genocide is. It's important to note that Palestinians in Gaza understood the destructive nature of the attack against them from the very beginning. And there's just a couple of quotes here. You can find many of this online. Community worker, started sending WhatsApp messages, and these WhatsApp messages and voice messages, these are testimonies, in effect. On October 10th, there were only 3 words in his first message: terror, terror, terror. On October 15th, he wrote, they are killing families, whole families. I want to forget what I saw. You can't imagine, beyond reality. 2 days later, he wrote, water and food, none, very little. We went to sleep in 2023 and woke up in 1948, he noted on October 18th. Andalib Adwan, a feminist writer and educator from Gaza City, remarked in a WhatsApp message on October 9th that, quote, the situation is indescribable. The horror is beyond imagination. She arrived with her family in Rafah on October 13th, a safe area at the time, and 4 days later experienced bombing all around us. There are so many, many dead and injured. And Palestinian poet Khiba Abu Nada wrote on October 9th that Israel's attack this time follows, quote, no pattern. Everything is bombed. Gaza from the north to the south being bombed in a chaotic, catastrophic manner, mass butchery, senseless assassination of everything. Now, anyone who knows just a little bit about the Holocaust will recognize in horror so much dehumanization of people who reach out to us with their words to call our attention to the catastrophe, the butchery, the senseless assassination of everything. It is precisely the history of the Holocaust that reminds us to center the voices of those facing state violence and genocide, not the perspective of the state, certainly not the perspective of leaders of extremely violent states, such as Netanyahu. I argue that the charge of genocide that South Africa brought against Israel in its submission to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, on 29th of December 2023, plays an important role in the reckoning with the weaponization of the Holocaust and the struggle to highlight finally the voices, the perspective, the knowledge of victims of state violence. There are many shortcomings with the process in the ICJ and the 3 provisional measure rulings, but I think there's also a lot of significance in them. The court issued a provisional ruling nearly a month later, on 26th of January, that South Africa succeeded in arguing that it is plausible that Israel is perpetrating genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. This provisional ruling, and 2 others that came afterwards, mark, I argue, the beginning of the end of the impunity that Israel has enjoyed in the international legal system. That's based on its idea that it's unique, right? That it can't perpetrate crimes in international law. It was particularly significant that the day of the provisional ruling was also the day of the hearing in another legal case related to Israel's attack on Gaza, the one that the Center for Constitutional Rights filed in federal court in California on behalf of Palestinian organizations and individuals against US President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for failure to abide by the legal obligations of states according to the UN Genocide Convention to prevent genocide, right, in Gaza, but also for their complicity with genocide due to the continued US military and diplomatic support to Israel after October 7th. The hearing in California began a few hours after the ICJ provisional ruling. Remarkably, Judge Jeffrey S. White allowed Palestinian plaintiffs to testify in court that day, both those who live in the US but were born and grew up in Gaza, and those who are now, or were at the time, in the West Bank and in Gaza. One after the other, they told the court over 5 hours of testimony about their family histories during the Nakba, their own experiences of Israeli mass violence, relatives they have lost after October 7th, neighborhoods in which they grew up that are no more, schools that Israeli bombings and invasions have turned to rubble, cafes where they will never be able to drink tea again, and feelings of dread and loss. Dr. Omer al-Najjar testified via Zoom from the hospital in Rafah, where he worked then, around the clock with barely any medical supplies. And this is just a short excerpt. I have lost everything in this war. I have nothing but my grief. This is what Israel and its supporters have done to us. Ahmed Abu Ful, a Palestinian lawyer working at Al-Haq, a Ramallah-based Palestinian human rights organization, the oldest Palestinian human rights organization, described how his grandfather had refused to leave Gaza City in October, even as his relatives told him that they would later return. This is exactly what they told me in 1948, he responded, having survived the Nakba, but never able to return to the place where he grew up. Dr. al-Najjar, Ahmed Abu Ful, and the other Palestinians in court that day said the word Nakba dozens and dozens of times, again and again, affirming with the force of truth embodied in this word that we have entered a new period beyond Israeli impunity as it intertwined with Nakba denial. Again, remember that Nakba denial is structural in Holocaust memory, but also in the international legal system. It was important that following the Palestinian plaintiffs came the turn of Holocaust scholar Barry Trachtenberg to take to the stand. Did anyone watch these proceedings, by the way? They're fully accessible online, like in parts, but you can see them. Highly recommended. He came to testify about the declaration that he had submitted together with fellow Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars Victoria Sanford and John Cox in support of the CCR case, drawing on his own work on the failure of the US to respond on time to the Nazi assault on Jews. Trachtenberg stressed the significance of Holocaust memory in the US and the urgent need for the US government not to repeat its failure and act now to stop, then, that is, to stop Israel's unfolding genocide in Gaza. While Judge White decided on 31st of January to dismiss the case on jurisdictional ground, he argued that the court cannot, in his view, interfere in government decision-making related to foreign policy. He nevertheless issued an unprecedented, really unprecedented ruling. And this is what he said. Both the uncontroverted testimony of the plaintiffs and the expert opinion proffered at the hearing on these motions, as well as statements made by various officers of the Israeli government intent to destroy, indicate that the ongoing military siege in Gaza is intended to eradicate a whole people and therefore plausibly falls within the international prohibition against genocide. As the ICJ has found, it is plausible that Israel's conduct amounts to genocide. Therefore, the court implores defendants, Biden, Blinken, and Austin, to examine the results of their unflagging support of the military siege against the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, considering the dozens and dozens of arms shipments to Israel after this ruling, Biden, Blinken, and Austin have clearly not listened to Judge White, certainly not to the Palestinians who testified in his courtroom, and they also wave away scholars like Barry Trachtenberg. Indeed, it was US President Biden who himself set the stage for the weaponization of the Holocaust when he visited Israel on October 18th and said that, quote, Hamas committed atrocities that recall the worst ravages of ISIS, unleashing pure, unadulterated evil upon the world. October 7th, which was a sacred Jewish holiday, became the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It has brought to the surface painful memories and scars left by millennia of antisemitism and the genocide of the Jewish people. The world watched then, it knew, and the world did nothing. We will not stand by and do nothing again. A powerful state with powerful allies and a powerful army, nuclear power, engaged in an attack against stateless Palestinians under decades of Israeli settler colonial rule, military occupation, siege, a host of violations of international law, is thus portrayed as powerless Jews in a struggle against Nazis. A world completely turned upside down. We should never accept this world turned upside down. Never. The historical context of Israeli settler colonialism in no way justifies or excuses the mass murder of hundreds of Israelis and migrant workers and the taking of over 240 hostages in the Hamas attack on October 7th. This was indeed the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But its context, of course, is absolutely different from the context of the attack on Jews during the Holocaust. And without the historical context of Israeli settler colonialism since the 1948 Nakba, we cannot explain how we got here, nor actually imagine different futures. Biden offered us instead the decontextualized image of pure, unadulterated evil. Biden resorted to this weaponization of the Holocaust not only immediately after October 7th, but like Israeli officials again and again, and also in his speech at the USHMM on 7th of May to mark Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day. And he used pretty much the same language. This ancient hatred of Jews didn't begin with the Holocaust. It didn't end with the Holocaust. That hatred was brought to life on October 7th on a sacred Jewish holiday. The terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth. No context, nothing. It was most likely then not a coincidence that as Biden was speaking in May, Israel crossed another one of Biden's quote unquote red lines and proceeded in its deadly invasion of Rafah. Now, the extent of US support for Israel this past year has surprised and shocked many people here in the US and around the world, because it is in the face of the ongoing and escalating violence all the time that we all see all the time, in the face of the largest mass protest movement in the US since the Vietnam War, in the face of numerous Palestinian citizens in the US who have lost dozens of family members in Gaza, in the face of unprecedented opposition by so many Jews in the US, in the face of an Israeli society and media immersed, unashamed in incitement to genocide, in the face of the large-scale killings of journalists and aid workers by Israel, in the face of the killing of US citizens by Israeli forces, in the face of the growing isolation of Israel and the US around the world, in the face of the ICJ, in the face of virtually all major human rights organizations, numerous UN reports, there's another one that came out just today, by the way, and the angry resignations of officials in the US government, and in the face of Israel spitting in the US government's face as it crossed all the red lines that the Biden administration has marked, only to receive every time more weapons, more money, more ammunitions to continue killing and destroying. So many people thus asked, why? Why? The answer I would like to suggest is rooted not just in the obvious denial of what we all see in front of our eyes this past year. It also harks back to the denial of the Nakba and its rationale, the denial of Israeli settler colonialism. It is urgent for the US government to deny Israeli settler colonialism, and again, no matter how much senior ministers in the Israeli government will declare their settler plans for Gaza in large public events, and no matter what the extremely violent Israeli settler project in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem continues and intensifies in the past year, and no matter that we see maps of southern Lebanon with the Israeli flag covering it, and so on and so forth, the US government will continue to deny Israeli settler colonialism, for if the US government will recognize this reality, past and present, the implication would be the need to finally come to terms with settler colonialism also here in the US, which is also, of course, denied and blurred and rationalized and marginalized and disavowed and on and on. It would mean, in other words, coming to terms not only with the foundational crime of the Israeli state, but also the foundational crime of the US state. And it would lay bare what the USHMM press release in response to Ocasio-Cortez back in June 2019 had already revealed, that our world is not actually a post-Holocaust world at all. We still live in a world structured politically and ideologically in the same way as the Holocaust world was. But we are also living in a time of change that few could have imagined before October 7th. For the voices of Palestinians who are facing Israel's genocidal assault are now, for the first time in the history of the ongoing Nakba, front and center around the world, really front and center. Also in national and international courts from California to The Hague, marking an era beyond impunity for Israel, when the crime of genocide might serve not as it emerged to blur the Nakba, to deny Israeli state violence, but now to support the struggle against it and the effort to envision a truly different decolonial world. It is indeed the voices of Palestinians that now point to a new era when the promise of Holocaust memory, to center the voices and experiences of survivors and forcibly displaced people, that promise now, at the beginning of what, again, I suggest we can call perhaps the era of global Nakba memory, that promise may finally be realized. Now, the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the unprecedented destruction that continues to unfold, also now in Lebanon, renders such a future nearly impossible to envision. I know this, even though I argue that it has actually begun to take shape. And I know that nothing will return the countless lives, the potential futures, the places, the memories, the societies that Israel has destroyed and is destroying in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and now in Lebanon. Genocide is final, and the grief is endless. But it is also crucial to stress here, I'm coming to an end, the acute danger that nearly 2 million Palestinians within Israel, Palestinians, citizens of Israel, face. They live in a society that is celebrating the genocide of their people in Gaza now for a year. A society that is now awash with war criminals who have killed, ruined, and plundered in Gaza and posted it proudly on social media. A society that views them, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, since it held them under military rule from 1948 to 1966, as enemies. indeed as the most dangerous enemies, the enemies within. Their position is actually very similar to Tutsis in Rwanda during the genocide in 1994, to Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I and the Armenian genocide, and especially as Israel intensifies further the regional war that it has already created. And so all this makes the fight for global Nakba memory particularly important and urgent, for it will mark a truly post-Holocaust and post-Nakba world, where the knowledge, the histories, the perspectives of people who face state violence, not those of state leaders and state authorities who attack them, will guide us to truth and to justice and to peace. And therefore, it is in this spirit that I conclude with Palestinian poet Khiba Abu Nada, who I mentioned, who penned a poem titled "I Grant You Refuge" on 10th of October, 10 days before an Israeli airstrike killed her. He ended the poem with these words: "I grant you refuge in knowing that the dust will clear, and they who fell in love and died together will one day laugh." Thank you.
We'll start with the responses. We'll start with, can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's very weird because we cannot hear ourselves amplified. We'll start with the first response by Professor Verdeja. Professor Verdeja is Professor of Peace Studies and Global Politics at the University of Notre Dame's Koch Institute and the Keough School of Global Affairs. He's also a concurrent associate professor in the Department of Political Science. He's the executive director of the Institute for the Study of Genocide, which is a nonprofit organization in New York, founded in 1982, and dedicated to promote research and policy analysis on the causes and prevention of genocide and political violence. His research interests include the causes and prevention of genocide and mass atrocities, genocide and mass atrocities early warning, social media, disinformation and violence, transitional justice, political reconciliation, trials and truth commissions, and artificial intelligence and violence early warning. Other research interests include contemporary political theory, particularly critical theory, and the Frankfurt School. His current work is on comparative genocide, trigger events of mass killing, mass atrocity prediction and prevention, and social media misinformation. It's really a great honor to have Professor Verdeja here with us to reflect and respond. So, podium is yours. Thank you.
So much. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Raz, for that very insightful and very powerful set of reflections on the present situation which we find ourselves. This is a difficult kind of panel to be on. It's a difficult kind of situation to be involved in because it's not only, of course, concerning analytical questions, issues of how we make sense of the world, applying the most accurate and precise concepts that we have available to us understand causality and processes of diffusion of certain types of events, et cetera. But there's a deep moral kind of component to this, and it raises profound questions about how we even make sense of the world in a more deeper sense. I'm going to get to that in a few moments, but I wanted to just start off my reflections, first of all, by just thanking Raz for his work on clarifying some of the really powerful factors and vectors at play here. I think what this does, as I was listening to the talk, what it does is it encourages us, first of all, to be skeptical or be hesitant to adopt reductive, simple binary categories when we analyze these types of complex phenomena. What this means essentially is that we need to reject this kind of reductive categorical thinking and think in a much more nuanced historical way. Think about context. This immediately invites the question, what is the starting point, right? Is the starting point October 7th, 2023, when Hamas and its allies carried out absolutely atrocious massacres and abductions? Or do we have to contextualize that within the broader set of dynamics of violence and power relations that already exist in this particular case? Do we go back to 1967? Do we go back to these originary discourses of mass trauma, the Holocaust and the Nakba, do we also go beyond that and try to understand the legacies of colonialism, but also how this has been absorbed and transformed and how its legacies continue to inform the politics in the present condition today? It seems to me that undoubtedly, following what Atalia had said earlier, and of course what Raz's comments point to, is the importance of emphasizing the need to think not only critically and with a sense of nuance, but also with a sense of humility. And what I mean by humility is an awareness that we're talking about real people and real human beings. And this should invite us to think very, very carefully about how we speak of them and the importance of giving them the normative and the moral and ethical attention that they deserve, regardless of who they are, regardless of whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whomever. So this first question that we're invited to consider here is the issue of starting point, but starting point from the perspective not of using reductive categorical thinking, but also, or more productively, I think, thinking in terms of historical context, which in turn invites us to explore the connections between the legitimacy of the state and the kinds of identities that the state may actually be advocating and defending. Here we have a case that is quite fascinating in many respects. We have a state that has been established that makes strong claims to liberal democratic principles of protecting and respecting and recognizing individual rights, but in fact prioritizing the rights of one group among others. And in that respect, these two things are in a fundamental tension, and what we see is explicitly the kind of apartheid system that exists today. And when I use the language of apartheid, it's a language that's been used widely already, including by Israeli Jewish organizations themselves who have been dealing with these questions for a long time. So again, we see this, this question of how to think of the foundations of the state and what the conditions of legitimacy are in the modern international global order. But I also want to just identify what I think are a series of crises that the present case has brought to the fore and that Raz has encouraged us to think about a little bit. The first is a crisis for genocide studies itself, and that's the domain of research that concerns genocide and Holocaust scholars. I won't go into this in a great deal of detail, but I think one of the key points to underscore here is that historically this field of research, which comes out of study of the Holocaust, and it's expanded particularly starting somewhat in the 80s, but really in the 1990s and onwards, always had the Holocaust as kind of a central pivot point. Many genocides were always examined and assessed to the extent that they were in conformity with what we knew about the Holocaust. And this has been an analytical and professional set of debates at trying to understand that genocide can take many different paths. There's the process of equifinality, if we were to use academic terms. There's many different ways to get there. This can look in a number of different ways. But the crisis of genocide studies that Raz has emphasized for us means also questioning some of the foundational concepts at the very heart of how we make sense of mass atrocities. What does it mean to be a perpetrator? How do we think of the nature of ideology? How do we think of the motives and the intentions of particular actors? And the rights and of victims, and who is grievable and who is not grievable. More concretely, I think what this means is it also raises, I think, an interesting set of questions around some of the categories that we use to make sense of these phenomena. One of them, of course, is genocide itself. Now, one of the challenges with the term genocide is that it has a legal definition that's been adopted in international law through the convention. But it's also used in terms of political discourse and policy to refer to anything that involves something like mass atrocities and massacres, though the term actually is more inclusive than that. But it's also used in moral discourse as a sign of moral approbation. It's meant to refer to the greatest evil possible. And in that respect, it invites a kind of moral hierarchy, that those people who suffer genocide are more worthy of our attention and our moral recognition than those who suffered something else, even if empirically on the ground, the experiences look the same. So the term itself resonates and operates in all of these different ways. And this has often been kind of a point of significant discourse, right? A significant debate. Part of the point about genocide is that what makes genocide somewhat distinct from other major crimes in international law is the emphasis not only on group destruction, and not just group repression, but group destruction, but also on the question of intentionality. That is, that the actions have to be committed in such a way that the perpetrators intend to bring about the destruction of the group in whole or in part. But this is an important point here, because I think a lot of the debates at the present moment tend to obfuscate some of the really important analytical points here. Often you will see, well, Israel is not committing genocide because it's engaged in a war of defense or of national security. there's a distinction between intentionality, which is what the crime requires proof of, and the motives that underpin that intentionality. There are many different motives or justifications that are compatible with the intent to destroy. It can be territorial acquisition, it can be a claim to security, it can be ethnic or racial supremacy or eradication, etc. We can imagine a lot of different types of motivations, but the point is those motivations are compatible with the intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. So the issue of whether it's genocide or not is an issue that is irrespective of the motives underpinning what the perpetrators themselves are doing. But what this does, at least in my mind, and especially as I was listening to Raz's talk, is it raises questions about even the legal categories that we have available to us. What Gaza has done, I think, is bring to the surface very much some of the failures or limitations of international law on these questions. One is limitations around genocide and the Genocide Convention itself. The International Court of Justice has historically used a very narrow interpretation of what intentionality means, so the threshold that has to be met. We'll see what the ICJ does in terms of this particular case in the future, but historically it's used a very narrow definition, so kind of a strict intentionality. But also for what we might refer to as war crimes law, or international humanitarian law, and the law of armed conflict. And what we see there is that both genocide and international humanitarian law has in large part, at least to my mind, has in large part been interpreted in a very statist way, a way that has historically been quite deferential to the interests and the powers of the state. We see this particularly in this case today, where when we talk about international humanitarian law, there's really only one principle that's emphasized by Israel and even by the United States for that matter, and it's the military necessity principle, right? But the other elements that are embedded within international humanitarian law, within the law of armed conflict, are not given the same type of attention that they should be. And that really reflects the ways in which the discourse, especially at the legal level, has at least partially been very responsive and very deferential to the interests of the state. So one crisis is a crisis of international humanitarian law. Another crisis is just our basic functional categories of how we make sense of these types of events, like the category of genocide. A third crisis, as I see it, and Raz mentioned and kind of spoke to this a little bit in passing, but I think it's central to many of the points you touched on, is the crisis of international or multilateralism, international cooperation to protect human rights. We effectively are living in a period when multilateralism is on its heels. The UN recently, the United Nations General Assembly recently had its summit for the future and the Pact for the Future, which was a kind of a re-articulation of the importance of multilateralism. It's difficult to see what legs this will have, but we effectively see kind of a crisis of multilateralism, and more concretely, a crisis around the ineffectiveness of the Security Council, which is the primary entity within the UN system that's supposed to be concerned with maintaining international peace and security. This is a product not only of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's continued repression and genocidal violence against a variety of different minorities within its own country, but it's also evident in the way the US continues to protect Israel, even though Biden may have a lot of choice words for Netanyahu. So there's a distinct crisis here for the possibility of multilateralism at the present moment. Fourthly, I would say there's another crisis more broadly, and it's something we haven't touched on, so I'll just mention it and then move on, but perhaps if anyone's interested, we can continue to discuss in the Q&A. A crisis for some of the bigger norms that have emerged over the past 20 plus years around collective protection of civilians' rights, and particularly around the norm of the responsibility to protect, which is this norm that was adopted in the early part of the 21st century by a number of different, by the UN system, in order to essentially prioritize the rights of civilians over the claims of sovereignty and non-intervention by states, right? That essentially has lost much of its support. It's been eroded heavily, but we see this particularly in this case. Lastly, I want to say just a couple of more points. How am I doing on time? Can I have another minute?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. A couple of more points, because it's such a rich, there's so much to say. I mentioned already that the law, in some respects, especially around around IHL, international humanitarian law, and genocide, has very much shown a kind of sensitivity or awareness or deferral to the power of the state. But there are other bodies of law that I think are very valuable and very pro-civilian in some respects, right? One is the body of international human rights law. When we think about apartheid, this is really kind of dealing with these questions. But there's also an international convention against discrimination. Convention Against Apartheid. And there's also the very important body around crimes against humanity, right? And crimes against humanity are interesting, distinct, I think, from genocide and international humanitarian law, or at least the laws of armed conflict, in that they really prioritize in a much more explicit way the rights of civilians and don't have as many restricting criteria around them in the way that these other bodies of law have. At the present moment at the UN, there are debates around establishing an international convention or treaty on the crimes against humanity. We'll see if it happens. It's kind of astounding that that doesn't exist. So crimes against humanity are by definition violations of international law. That's established. But there's no convention in the same way there's for genocide or the set of Geneva Conventions, et cetera. So that's that's something to look forward to and to reinforce. Lastly, two final points. One is what the case of Gaza and Palestine, Israel has shown us is it's brought much more attention and much more light to a kind of a crisis around the legitimacy of the foundations of a democratic state. What does it mean to be able to claim to be a democratic state and nevertheless engage in these kinds of practices, right? In some respects, this isn't new. In some respects, we could have had this conversation several decades ago about a different case. If we were talking about South Africa, which was never really democracy, but it had the trappings of it on the outside. This is, in some respects, it's kind of history repeating itself. But nevertheless, I do think this is a very specific and a very important historical juncture that we find ourselves in. So there are profound questions here around the nature of legitimacy for states and how that should be recognized and recorded in the international or in the global order. Lastly, I just want to go back to my very first point, which is as we navigate and try to make sense of this, we're trying to make sense on two different registers, right? And this is kind of the other crisis, the final crisis that we're confronting here. There is the register of explanation. I'm using Max Weber's language here, but slightly distorting it, all respect. One is the language of explanation. How do we make sense of phenomena in the world? The behavior of perpetrators, the behavior of victims, the dynamics of violence, the process of escalation, abeyance, decline of violence, all of those things that social scientists and lawyers and anyone else who is a scholar, researcher, journalist, et cetera, an observer, tries to do. But there's also a different register, which is the register of what I want to refer to as understanding. We can make sense of the world in terms of the processes and dynamics of what's happening. We can make sense of all of this in some respects. But to actually understand how this type of violence, I think, is a rupture in our very moral order, that's a little different. And that's where the humility comes back. But it's also enjoining us to do something about this, to tell ourselves and ask ourselves, why do we live in a world like this? And to tell ourselves we can be in a different kind of world. So I encourage us as we come out of this, even though the domain of explanation might be incredibly depressing, and it absolutely is, the domain of understanding, which perhaps has kind of epistemic limit to it, it's a difficult horizon. One can never transgress the horizon, right? That's the point of the horizon. It's a horizon, it's on the horizon, we try to reach it, we fall short. While we try to make sense of this, it also must be a demand, a call on us, a burden on us to try to make the world a little bit different. So with that, thank you very much for your comments.
So finally, before we turn to the discussion, we are going to Gaza with the experience of Dr. Thalia Pachiyannakis, who is a local OBGYN here in South Bend. She's been practicing here since 2017. And currently she's working in Heart City Women Health in Elkhart. And Dr. Thalia volunteered in Gaza for 3 weeks in June, and she will share with us what she saw, what she witnessed. So Dr. Thalia, thank you for making the time to be with us.
So I was in Gaza from June 20th to July 12th. So I'm just going to talk to you about my experience. I was there for 3 weeks. It was very difficult going to Gaza. There's a lot of restrictions. You have to be approved by the WHO, and then Israel has to finally make the decision, and anything can change at any moment. It's so hard to explain the devastation in Gaza and to put everything I need to say in a 5-minute interview or speech. When you first come back from Gaza, you have so much hope that you will be able to make a difference, and then time passes and you see that nothing has changed. What do you say to everyone that you have left behind? They're suffering. The violence of Israel and the people of Palestine has only escalated, and now the deaths of innocent civilians are by the hundreds. There's nowhere safe in Gaza, and there's nowhere to go. These are some of the restrictions that we get before we go into Gaza. We're allowed only one suitcase. We're supposed to go for 4 weeks, but I only wanted to go for 3 weeks because I had to come back to work. But I wouldn't know when I would be able to leave or exit. That would have to be decided last minute. So I was going into Gaza not knowing when I was returning. And we all had to have a meeting because we had to go through Amman, Jordan, and the meeting there told the doctors were that they couldn't guarantee our safety. This is us, the other organizations, Red Cross, Red Global, and I went with the organization Beit Mal. We're lining up to go on this bus to go to the Jordanian border and Israel border and then into Gaza. There are plenty of checkpoints, and a trip that should take a few hours takes way longer. So once we get to the border in Gaza, we have to enter bulletproof cars, the UN convoy. All the directions and determinants are approved by the IDF. So once you enter Gaza, you can see all the destruction. So once we entered the UN building, our respective organizations picked us up. Most of the doctors will stay in the hospital because it's supposed to be safer, but we stayed at Al Mawasi with the civilians. Al Mawasi is a long strip of beach where all the people are staying in tents. Actually, almost everybody are living in tents with no fridges, no water, no air conditioning, and the temperature at the time was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This is Al Mawasi. So the next day we went into Nasser Medical Complex. This is the same hospital that was invaded in February 2024. This is the same hospital that in April they found the mass grave of 300 people, including healthcare workers. You can see that by the time I went in June, it was functioning barely with limited supplies. This is where the mass grave was. I'm pointing to it right there. This is a pediatric floor. You can see the children with hepatitis A all in the hallway. There was no beds. This is a room where some of the patients would be admitted to after delivery. This is the most shocking. This is the labor room. You can see the beds are broken. They have no supplies. This is one warmer, and the babies born would share the same warmer. There were about 30 to 50 deliveries a day, and there's only one monitor, one non-stress test or CTG that monitors the women in labor. This would lead to fetal deaths, delayed C-sections, and us not being able to monitor women that are in labor. This is the ICU. We have a boy with type 1 diabetes, 12 years old, didn't have his insulin, and was admitted with hepatitis A. I went to wash my hands in the ICU, but there was no soap. This is a boy severely injured by the airstrikes. I was actually in the ICU because there was a female 6 weeks pregnant that had been injured, and we were trying to get a heartbeat on the baby to see if it's alive or not. But we didn't even have an ultrasound. These are some of the nurses I worked with. They come to work for free, all the doctors, all the healthcare workers. They hadn't been paid for 9 months by then, and now it's been a year. The lady in black is Dua, she's the head OR nurse. I one day was speaking to her about surgery numbers, and she saw a picture of my kids on my phone. And then she told me that her 3 children were murdered, killed by an airstrike, and her brother. There was 17, 14, and 12. And I said, when? And she said, 3 months ago. She only has one living child, Sama. She's 10 years old. She's severely traumatized and depressed and doesn't talk much. This is a picture of me and Sama. She used to come to work and hang out with me. This is Dr. Ahmed Al-Smiri. He is an anesthesiologist. He was taken hostage during the invasion for 2 months. This is Dr. Allah. He's anesthesiologist. He was taken hostage for 49 days. He was abused. He lost 60 pounds and was beaten. This is us performing cesarean sections. We had limited drapes, no scrubs, and if an instrument fell on the floor, we would just wash it with saline and reuse it. We had to operate with no air conditioning at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, sweating into the wounds of patients. A lot of them would return with severe wound infections because of the lack of sanitation in the hospital and in the tents where they lived. They would save the fuel in the hospital because there was lack of fuel by switching off the air conditioning. These are the little babies being born into an uncertain world. There was severe malnutrition of the healthcare workers. All the physicians had lost weight, 30 kilos, 60 pounds. This little girl will die if she doesn't leave Gaza. She's 9 months old and weighs 8 pounds. She has severe vitamin D deficiency. You can see the bumps on her ribs. Lining up for water every morning. Every morning the children would line up for water. We were thirsty. We were all sick with diarrhea, scared to drink water because it was contaminated. And we were all sick, and having diarrhea was very common. We were scared to eat, scared to drink. There was bombing continuously while I was there, and air drones. You could hear the drones continuously. Sometimes the bombs were so loud that they would shake the building. And we'd hope that we'd die in one piece, like our bodies intact. And that our families could identify us. I had pictures of my kids on my neck. Bombing outside the hospital twice when I was there, and once in a UN school. I remember a story, Asil, she's a nurse practitioner from Ann Arbor, Michigan. She held a baby in her arms all night because her mother was killed and her father was in surgery. When I was there, they evacuated the European hospital, and that caused havoc because that meant that 600 patients had to come to Nasser Hospital. We had patients walking and coming in hospital beds, and we didn't know where to put them. That same day that they ordered the evacuation of the European hospital, Dr. Mohammed Abu Salmiya was released after 7 months of being held hostage and tortured in the prison. He was the director of Al-Shifa Hospital. We met in the evening, he was released, and he was straight back to work telling and helping us plan a way to save the equipment from being destroyed and making room for the patients in a hospital that was already overwhelmed. The head of the hospital, Nasser Hospital, lives in this tent. This is pictures of me teaching the students and residents. This is me outside Al-Aqsa Hospital with Dr. Hina Chima. And this little boy here in the blue scrubs is famous. He is a little volunteer and he helps out. So they call him Dr. Zakaria. This is the organization I went to, Beitul Mal. So if you feel free, if you feel like you want to donate somewhere that will hopefully go to the people in Palestine, you can use this link, Thalia for Hope, and that is my QR code. Most importantly and lastly, I want to share with you that Dr. Feroz Sidwa and Dr. Mark Perlmutter, Dr. Adam Hamaway, and I have created this website, GazaHealthcareLetters.org. This is the website that you can go and read all the letters written by the doctors and nurses that have been to Gaza. You'll find the UK letter, the Canadian letter, and the US letter. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thalia. Let's take a few minutes to turn to whoever is sitting next to you and just kind of share, like immediately kind of release what people are feeling, thinking, and then we'll collect the questions on the note card. So just an opportunity to talk to one another.
Yeah, we can.
So far, people are being very shy. So we have one question. How are the methods used by the military and the Israeli government being replicated in other global contexts? What does this mean for resistance?
You have
Use an extra mic right next to you.
So. Thank you. That's what I think. Thank you so much. This is a really good question. Just very briefly, I think that one of the things that we've seen over the past, at least since the so-called global war on terror started, has been, we were just talking about this very briefly, has been more and more effectiveness by states at using the language of legal discourse in order to justify what effectively are atrocities, right? So becoming much more sophisticated in the use of this. Now, not all states do so. Some states don't care about international law, right? Russia doesn't really care that much. But other countries, United States, particularly in its prosecution of civil wars, Israel in the current moment, et cetera, we see a much more sophisticated kind of use of law against the norms and principles that underpin law. So that's the first point. The second point is so much conflict is happening more and more, particularly in dense urban areas. I mean, this goes through waves. Historically, it's happened as well. But this means that the language and kind of the system of law that we have doesn't really adequately deal with these types of situations and scenarios very effectively. So this is a significant challenge, and it's difficult to see what the next step in resolving this, at least at the legal level, would be. I mean, it's much more an issue of kind of politics and collective support for changing the way in which this is done. The final point about resistance, I think, is a really fascinating question. I would actually be curious to hear what my co-panelists think about that. So I'll pass it on rather than just continue speaking.
Yeah, you have one. Yeah.
So, so the question, can you read it again?
Basically, how the Israeli exporting the tactics and of the technologies maybe of the Israeli military to other contexts, and what does it mean for resistance?
Well, I mean, there's a number of international contexts, perhaps, to mention. if we think about the weaponization of the Holocaust, for example, right, then we've seen a very similar weaponization to the Israel weaponization of the Holocaust not too long ago in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, right, which was framed, can you hear me? Just hold it maybe, which was framed as denazification of Ukraine. It's important to say, by the way, that in January 2020, Putin was the main speaker in a conference at Yad Vashem, Israel's main Holocaust memory and education center, and he took the opportunity to present a completely distorted picture of World War II with completely distorted maps, by the way. This with all of the Holocaust scholars of Yad Vashem sitting in the audience, right? Completely erasing the Soviet-Nazi pact of 1939, basically, and presenting, and this is the key, Ukrainians as primarily Nazi collaborators, right? And then a bit more than 2 years later, he used exactly this presentation at Yad Vashem in order to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is important because, again, it points to a structural issue, right, of how global Holocaust memory, right, is used in order to legitimize the position of the state and state violence and not to protect its victims, right? That's one international context, and of course, there's so much more to say about this, but that's one international context. The other that immediately came to mind when I'm thinking about international context and arms deals, which you hinted at, Atalia, is Nagorno-Karabakh, right? Because just before the 7th of October, we all witnessed the complete ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan with very significant armed support from Israel, right? And the key issue is that this came after a 9-month-long siege on Nagorno-Karabakh, that is starvation policy. And here so I'll just say a comment about this and then something about resistance, okay, very briefly. The comment about this is very important because one of the things I personally don't want to see the international legal system collapse, right? We're all clear that the international legal system is on the verge of collapse now, okay? And I don't think that it should collapse, right? Why? For example, the US government wants it to collapse. The Israeli government wants it to collapse. Do you know that the US has a law that if US nationals are put on trial in The Hague, the US will send its military, right, to make sure that they're not on trial in The Hague,
It's the
right?
Hague Invasion Act.
Yep, the Hague Invasion Act. So if the US government and Israel have a problem with the international legal system, then I think it's a good reason to think that we might want to keep it, right? But the thing is that it has to change, right? And the issue when we look at this international context of starvation, Nagorno-Karabakh and Gaza, Israel, Azerbaijan, arms deals, all these kinds of things, but starvation is actually changing how we think about genocide. This is based on scholarship that's been ongoing in the last decade about settler colonial genocide, specifically genocide by attrition. And what's the key issue here about intent is that at a certain point of these long processes of starvation, right, perpetrators cannot anymore deny that they know and understand the consequences of their actions, right? Which then speaks directly to the issue of intent. So genocide, there's this idea that that's it, genocide, and it won't change, and it's it is. After the ad hoc tribunals of Rwanda changed the international law about genocide because sexual violence came to be, viewed legally as an act of genocide, for example. So that's, again, so much more to say about this. But then one last point about resistance. There's resistance to all of this, right? There's a number of practical things, okay? For example, we can all partake in BDS, okay? And we know that this has an effect, okay? The Israeli economy is collapsing it'll take a lot more time perhaps, right? But BDS has an effect today, right? So BDS is one thing and again, many more practical things that we can say, but I wanted to end with a comment that is a bit utopian. In fact, what we're seeing in front of our eyes is the continued assault on truth, but on truth that, a lot of these US politicians, State Department officials, I mean, it strikes me as so strange because they think they're in the 80s, right? They'll tell us lies and we're like in this Cold War state of mind, and that's it. That's how it'll be. But then no, we all check our phones. It's like, dude, no, that's not what's going on, right? Now, why does that mean that now it's this weaponization of anti-Semitism? So if you dare to speak the truth, you're an anti-Semite, which is a very powerful accusation. So yes, for each person, and we're in a university now, and this weaponization is very strong in universities now, to silence, to intimidate, to shut down, right? And it works because it's very frightening. It's very scary. People don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to be socially ostracized. So many things are at stake, right? And I understand all of this, right? But if if each of us are silent or one person speaks up, that's one thing. If 5 people speak up, that's better. 10 is already something. 100 is significant. 1,000, you get my point, right? That's where it's utopian, right? We all need to insist, as I said, to refuse the world upside down picture that we're constantly, right, thrown in our face, this absurdity, these cruel absurdities, and we all have to insist, right, on the truth, on speaking up about what we all see in front of our eyes, right? So it's a bit utopian, but I wanted to say that.
Great, and also I think you just touched on some other questions. I was perusing through the questions. So I'm going to put on the table a few questions that I think each one of, I mean, you don't have to respond to all, but there is a little bit for everyone. So the first question makes reference to a piece that was published in the New York Times yesterday and reported on 44 healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza and saw multiple cases that appear to represent kind of targeting of preteen children, so under 12, who had been shot in the head or chest in Gaza. And so, that the questioner wants to understand to what degree, Dr. Thalia, you saw it also as a pattern with the patients that you saw, especially the children, and what does it mean? This is one question. Another question that came from the audience is how is intentionality measured in the context of genocide? How do you identify intentionality? How has Israel's intention changed since the Nakba of 48, the 67 war until now? So this is the question. The third question is how do the Yazidi, Rohingya, Darfur, Rwanda, and other genocides inform our understanding of the genocide in Gaza? The Yazidi genocide was also 43,000 deaths killed. And then finally, what advice do you have for academics writing and publishing on topics that are violently rejected to the point of threatening our safety? So these are a few of the questions that I chose. Dr. Thalia, do you want to start?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Feroz Sidwa is the one that kind of took the lead on writing the article in the New York Times. He actually went to school with my husband, Dr. Christopher Jordan, in Flint, Michigan. They were in high school together? Yeah. Anyway, so it's a small world. I did not so Dr. Mark Perlmutter and Dr. Feroz Sidwa are both trauma surgeons. We have a WhatsApp group where all the doctors that have been to Gaza and healthcare workers speak about what we can do next to try bring awareness and for a ceasefire and arms embargo. So the trauma surgeons are the ones that mostly saw these, and anesthesiologists, people working in the ER that saw those atrocities, like, the trauma, the sniper injuries. I was lucky that I was in the maternity ward and I did not witness this, but Dr. Mark Perlmutter says that 100% of the sniper injuries were to children.
I'll say something about also in relation to what you said. Ernesto, on the crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies in the field. Then what was the last question about scholars?
How can scholars continue to write and research and talk about at such a degree that their own safety is threatened on those kind of issues?
So, what we're seeing, and this is the thing now about intent, as I said before, I think it is already changing, specifically in regard to starvation, which brings back the issue of settler colonial genocide, right? Which is what's happening, right? So that's one thing. Crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies. The field of Holocaust and genocide studies, I work in this field of Holocaust and genocide studies, was, as I said, has a very strange title because it embodies this hierarchy, right? And Holocaust and genocide studies, is part and parcel of global Holocaust memory. I mean, the USHMM has a research arm, right? Yad Vashem has a research arm, right? There's funding, there's all kinds of structural. Holocaust and genocide studies also functions according to this issue of uniqueness. Holocaust unique, as you said, Ernesto, right? And then Israel's unique, but it's also about Jews. It's Holocaust Jews. It's a triad of uniqueness. Holocaust Jews, Israel, right? Unique. So Holocaust and genocide studies, I would actually say are, as a field, we're complicit in this state of affairs, right? As a field. And that's why the field is in absolute crisis. Crisis means that there are scholars, unfortunately, primarily scholars dealing with the Holocaust, and I'm a Holocaust scholar, right? Who are, for them, it's business as usual. We continue as usual, right? And Israel is only defending. There's a lot of those, hundreds. Israel is only defending itself. Everything is fine. Nothing to see here, basically, right? And they've written some horrific articles justifying genocidal violence and dehumanizing Palestinians, right? And then there's other scholars, and then it's not by accident, mostly scholars who deal with genocide and mass atrocities more broadly, and there's a lot of those as well, right? Who are saying, no, absolutely not. We're, even if not genocide, definitely the risk of genocide, right? Which activates the convention legally, by the way, right? But also war crimes and crimes against humanity, which, as you said, Ernesto, on the ground, it doesn't look different, right? And for the victims who face this, it doesn't really matter, right? How other people are defining what they're experiencing in real time, right? So there is a massive crisis in the field. And this now opens up, right, I think, again, a process that has been going on in our field for some time, right, that we have been thinking about genocide through these hierarchies, right, in certain ways. So it does open up new questions now, right, as we think, for example, this connection between Nagorno-Karabakh and Gaza, which Elisa Mardian has written recently about. This all does actually put scholars sometimes in danger, right? Because truth is actually it's a threat. Now, saying the truth, insisting on the truth, right, is research and teaching is a threat. That's why people are intimidated and threatened. And we're seeing now people fired and losing, tenured people fired and losing their jobs. I'm not even talking about hundreds of untenured faculty members, adjuncts who have lost their jobs or jobs discontinued since 7th of October, right, for daring to speak and to teach about the truth. So this does put, one last thing about this, I'll just say, which is important, this weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, which is part of the weaponization of Holocaust memory and history, targets, of course, first and foremost, Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims, but now more and more, it's also targeting Jews, right? And in some cases, even Israeli Jews, right? So we're seeing, and I'm noting this because, again, we're in this, the absurdity is just blowing up in front of our eyes all the time, right? And again, I want to emphasize, and again, this may be completely utopian, but one of the ways to deal with it is collectively to insist, right, on the truth in front of our eyes. And I'm not saying this lightly. I know that this is very, very scary. It's much more difficult than just saying it, right? But like everything, basically, if we do it together, right, it's much more powerful. It's much more significant. It requires organization and compromises and all these things that could be very, very complex. But
so thank you so much. A couple of just quick thoughts. One on the issue of intentionality. So when I said that genocide, the Convention on Genocide is statist in the sense that it's kind of deferential to the state, what I meant by that is that there's a very high threshold for proving that genocide is occurring. And a lot of this has to do with satisfying the requirement of intentionality. So there's a legal discussion and debate around that, and that deals not only with the present case, but cases like Bosnia versus Serbia, and a number of important cases, for instance, within the ICJ that have happened in the past. So there's a high threshold there that I think is potentially difficult to meet. We'll see how the current South Africa case plays out in the next few years. We don't know. I'm skeptical, but that might be just more of a me problem than anything else. Having said that, I think that scholars who work on genocide, kind of comparative genocide, like me and like Raz and many other people, see this as a case of genocide. The debate among scholars, I'm going to kind of give you a sense of what I mean by that in a moment, but the debate among genocide scholars from the very beginning was actually quite narrow, the range of debate. It was largely between people who said this is a genocide, and Raz was at the very forefront of identifying this, I think, in the most sophisticated way, and a handful of other people, and those who said this could turn into genocide, but it has all the indications of it, which is how I thought of it at the very beginning. It's a very, very narrow debate that we're talking about, okay? Now, when I say that, that's largely among scholars who see themselves as genocide comparativists, that is people who work on a lot of cases and not only the Holocaust, as well as the way that the field is kind of transforming itself now, where you have more and more people talking about atrocity scholarship or mass atrocity scholarship. So if we were to do genealogy, we would say, you know, it started off by a heavy emphasis on the Holocaust studies. That still exists, it's quite powerful. Then genocide studies, which comes out really in the 90s, but with roots in the 70s and 80s, but really in the 1990s and onwards. And then today, more scholars who are interested in thinking about how genocide connects to other forms of mass atrocities. Having said that, we're all broadly under this purview of genocide research, genocide studies. So for those people who are more comparatively inclined, when you look at other cases, and what you essentially see is that Gaza satisfies all of the criteria for genocide. It's one thing to talk about it from the perspective of a social scientist. It's another thing to talk about in the legal domain. On the point about advice for scholars, I really don't have much more to add to that. I think that people who have protected jobs, like tenured faculty, have a responsibility to step up and speak about what they see with as much evidence and as much grounding in scholarly methods and expectations and norms and all of these things that we take seriously as researchers. But you have an obligation to call out what you see, with the understanding, the proviso that in fact even tenured people at some institutions are suffering significant repercussions. But that's just the nature of the uneven character of this particular profession, right? Some people are more protected than others. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go now with the final round of questions. The first two kind of interrelated note cards. One writes for Raz. You mentioned imagining a different future. Can you say more about what this might look like and what we can do to help realize a better future? And then a second note card there says, what is the difference between being anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic? And could you talk about the right of return and the possibility of all Israelis leaving the stolen land? So these two I see as interrelated questions. Third question, how do you navigate discourses that we need to engage with both sides of the conflict? And finally, with both major US parties running on platforms of strong support for Israel, what can I, as a voter, student, and citizen do to advocate for an end to genocidal action in Palestine? So maybe an opportunity to reiterate some of the points. Yeah, that's, so Raz, do you want to start with those questions?
Yeah.
Dr. Thalia?
So I don't think there are sides in this sort of violence, whatever we want to call it, right? And you know, we have to understand also that even cases that are, you know, there's a significant consensus that they're a genocide, right? I mentioned the Herero and Nama, for example, in German Southwest Africa, right? The genocide was a result of the uprising of the Herero, which was very violent. That is, they attacked German settlers and their families and murdered them, right? The Germans, colonialists, were acting from their perspective, from what we would call today self-defense, right? And like the Israelis, they were fighting, a war against barbarians. This, by the way, harks back to the origins of international law, because international law was always about regulating wars between civilized nations, that is Europeans. It was never meant to apply to colonial warfare, right? That's just the basic history of how international law emerges. So that's what we're seeing in front of our eyes now. There are no two sides to that. I know that's more complicated. but I don't see sides here when we see a destructive assault of this kind against, a people and a culture and their society and their lands in this way. Now, this attack is meant, the rationale of the Israeli state has always been that this is the way to provide security to Jews, right? Or this is one of the rationales of the Israeli state, okay? Now, this, of course, was a system that meant that my security as an Israeli Jew, I'm speaking here, right, was based on the insecurity and the oppression, right, of Palestinians. Now, has this worked? We can ask Israeli Jews, has this worked? Do you feel safe today, right? Of course it hasn't worked, right? Of course it hasn't worked. Now, what does this mean? When I say different and decolonial futures, what I mean is that on the one hand, it's very simple, right? There needs to be a different political arrangement, right? Of all the people who live, right, between the river and the sea. That is 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Palestinians. And again, in a sense, it's very simple. It should be a political arrangement that recognizes everyone's need for security and dignity and rights and humanity and belonging equally, right? Now, the thing is that, of course, if that doesn't happen, then Israeli Jews will feel, more insecure, not, more secure, as they're feeling now. If there's anything that we can learn from October 7th is that this Israeli project has not worked, right? Now, there's so many other things that we can say about this, but the main thing that comes to my mind is that it's so, as I said also, it's so difficult to imagine right now something like this, right? In the midst of this genocidal assault and the intensification of the same kind of assault now in the West Bank and the intensification of regional war and Israel's unbelievable destruction and killing now in Lebanon. It's very difficult to imagine this, but so this is one last thing about this, and then I'll say something about anti-Zionism. And we humans have a very difficult time, especially I think late modern humans have a very difficult time in imagining change, which is a fact in history, right? And sometimes even significant change. Sometimes it's very fast. There is sometimes change that's very fast, and there is sometimes change that, takes more time. But what we're seeing now, I mean, as I said, the Israeli economy, for example, is collapsing. We know that tens of thousands of Israeli Jews are leaving the country, right? And they tend to be the more central people in the country's economy and culture and politics and so on and so forth, right? This can't, I mean, again, a society and economy doesn't run only on 4,000 or 10,000 ton bombs, right? So it can't last, right, this thing. Everyone there has an interest, right, of a different future. Israeli Jews, for the most part, don't see it right now at all. They're completely immersed in a genocidal rhetoric. But this will change, right? This will change. And part of the process of change, again, is that if we all insist, right, on the truth of what's happening in front of our eyes right now, Now, so again, saying this truth is now tagged in this weaponization of the discourse of anti-Semitism as anti-Semitic. And I mean, it's very, again, in a sense, this is very simple. Anti-Zionist, let's just talk about anti-Zionist Jews, okay, like me, for example, right? Anti-Zionism is as old in the Jewish world as Zionism, and it's a form of modern Jewish identity, right? That means that if you now, in this weaponized discourse, right, come and tell anti-Zionist Jews that they're anti-Semitic, in this weaponized discourse, what this means is that you are attacking Jews for the way that they are expressing their identity, which is anti-Semitic, right? And again, this is the kind of absurdities that we are now facing, and they're blowing up in our face. I mean, anti-Zionism was in some cases dominant in the Jewish world in some places and in some times, right? And now it's also growing in the Jewish world, and for good reason, right? So no, anti-Zionism is absolutely not anti-Semitism. This conflation of a state of a people, which we all should understand. If I critique Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right, and I critique the ideology of Putin, right, does this somehow mean that, let's choose this word, hate, because it's very dominant in this discourse and it's very problematic itself, but does this mean that I hate all Russians anywhere, everywhere? No, of course not, right? It means that I'm critiquing a state and its ideology and its violent actions, right? Now, that's the same for any state, right? In that sense. Singling out, indeed, Israel here for protection from this, right, actually feeds into an anti-Semitic idea again that Jews are special. That's an anti-Semitic idea. And the Nazis thought that Jews are special, by the way, in a negative way, right? There is a connection, as many scholars have shown us, between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, right? So anti-Zionism is absolutely not anti-Semitism. And also, and one last thing about this, this is a discussion in the US, right? And only in the US, it's a discussion about incorporating this weaponized discourses into law, which is, of course, an unbelievable violation of First Amendment, right? Also, anti-BDS laws, I mentioned BDS, are an unbelievable violation of First Amendment. So again, we can sit here and talk about so many absurdities in front of our eyes, right? But here it is. We are told that only with regard to one state around the world, we can't critique it, right? When we can't critique something that the International Court of Justice has said is plausible, right? That Israel is perpetrating genocide. So we must never accept that, right? We must insist that anti-Zionism is absolutely not anti-Semitism, and critiquing the state and its policies could be harsh, could be uncomfortable for some people. Absolutely, fine, right? But absolutely not anti-Semitic.
I don't have too much more to add to that. I think on the question of how to navigate discourses that talk about both sides, the kind of the both-sidism question, I would simply emphasize that whenever we're talking about any complex political phenomena, you have to take seriously the asymmetries in power, right? And the discourse or the language of kind of both sides sometimes functions to cover up or obfuscate that, because it treats all of the different sides, so to speak, first of all, as monolithic sides, as if there is a Jewish side, and we've just heard the complexity around that, or a Palestinian side, or a Muslim side, et cetera. So we need to disentangle that a little bit, one. And two, we need to take seriously that there are, again, power differentials here. And so the language of sidism, I think, reproduces this myopia around what actually is happening on the ground, which is why, following my earlier comment, one has to start from the perspective of evidence. What is the evidence? It's fascinating to me, as a scholar based in the United States, how much that kind of language is happening here. And sometimes, at least in the American context right now, the emphasis has been so much on students and young students, and this kind of patronizing discourse around the perspective of students around these questions. But if you talk to anyone who works on peace building and human rights internationally, professionally, if you talk to people at the UN, right, who are actually involved in humanitarian work, they're pretty explicit about what they're seeing. And they dovetail perfectly with what Dr. Thalia was just showing us earlier. So this isn't some kind of other side of the position. And there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of kind of information here, proof about what's happening. Following that, I guess the last point will simply be that sometimes connected to this language of both sides, there's this framing of, Israel should not be held to a different standard. And I actually completely agree with that. I think Israel should be held to the standard of international law, like every other country on the planet. And it's failing its obligations on international law, and it's also failing just a whole range of different human rights and humanitarian obligations more generally. So that's the final point I would mention about that.
Raz, final.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate again that what we're seeing. So the reason, as I said, this connects to the issue of the importance of speaking and insisting on the truth, because what we're seeing is an accident of the system, right? This system that came about after World War II of international law, and then afterwards also tied to global Holocaust memory in the 1990s, right? Where we were not supposed to be seeing so clearly in front of our eyes this sort of destructive assault by Israel. As long as it was like slow, right? Slow violence, as we call it in the field, right? That was fine. We could all play the game of not noticing, denying, blurring, right? On the ground, of course, it was continuously, intensifyingly more horrific, actually, right? Even that slow violence. But this is an accident of the system, and it's an accident of the system because the Israelis now are saying the quiet part out loud. That is explicit settler colonial violence and images and barbarians and Nazis and Amalek and what have you, right? And they're doing it also outright, right? Not slow and not incremental and not long-term process, but and they've done it. That is it. Gaza is destroyed completely, right? The West Bank is on its way to being destroyed completely, right? And as I said, Israeli Palestinians are in acute danger. So their genocide prevention actually is still an issue, right? Very much an issue, right? When we think about it in this way. But now, because it's an accident of the system, then it's all out in the open. That's why the ICJ cannot actually but come to the conclusion that it is plausible that Israel is perpetrating genocide. Plausible at this point. I disagree, actually, Ernesto. I think that they won't have, a choice this time, right? I just can't see how. I understand the skepticism, right? But I can't see how they cannot, right? It's crossed literally all the red lines, right? And when we think about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, a very conservative international lawyer, Karim Khan, as the chief prosecutor, when they posted the video of the request for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant and the Hamas leaders, if you noticed, I don't know if you noticed, but if not, go back and look at it. And he's been saying this again and again since then. He emphasized the issue of impunity, which is a structural issue, right, that emerges with the system, right, from the very beginning, impunity in general in the system, but specifically impunity to Israel. And that's breaking down now. And I'm mentioning all of this in the accident of the system, right? And that's why the weaponization of anti-Semitism is becoming more and more absurd. And now attacking Jews and Jewish Israelis, right? Actually attacking more and more Jews, right? In a very, very absurd way. All this means that the system is in acute crisis. Now, I don't want the system to collapse, right? But it has now the potential for significant change. And we can say there is an argument to be made that without the mass protests in the US and around the world, by the way, it's not clear if South Africa would have brought the case against Israel to the ICJ. So there's a massive role that all of us can play in this, right? In protests, in speaking the truth, in BDS, in so many things, right? And it's very scary and there will be a lot of consequences to it, right? But if people do it together and insist on doing it and continue to do it, right? Then yes, there is a possibility for a different world. It might all not work because we're against massive power, right? But it might work, right? So it's worth a try, I think.
So before we close, I wanted to and thank our speaker. I want to alert you to two forthcoming events that are very relevant. The first is a screening of a film called Indeed that is produced by a Palestinian Israeli citizen and Jewish Canadian filmmaker, and it really captures a form of radical imagination. What the city Lid, that was targeted during the Nakba of 48, how it would look like if the Nakba never happened. So very, very interesting. And the film directors will be present. So this is co-sponsor event with DPAC. I'm very excited about this.
When?
Oh, sorry, November 10th. So exactly a month from today. And then the third event is in December 12th. And it really connects to the point that Raz just mentioned. It's about a new book called Safety Through Solidarity that offers a complex analysis of why fighting against anti-Semitism means to also fight against anti-Black racism and all other forms of racism. That it's not a special kind of racism, but all those racism interconnected and our safety interconnected. So this will be an event with the co-authors of this book based on their research and evidence. So, yeah. And so with this, let's thank our panel.